Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kitty Douglas, and I am president of BigTent USA. At BigTent, we are steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, the Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower you with facts and calls to action so you can become a stronger and more effective advocate for our country. I don't want to alarm anyone, but it is 90 days exactly until Election Day. And that means that every single one of us will have to take action between now and November 3rd to ensure some kind of check on President Trump's lawlessness. I hope that you'll check out our letter writing program in key states and our new partnership with Christopher Armitage of the Existentialist Republic. He's going to be working with us on incredible calls to action for all of us to do between now and November. Our newsletter will have more details, and that drops tomorrow. So I hope you'll open it and check out things that you can do with Christopher Armitage and BigTent. On Monday, this coming Monday, Chris Armitage and Rick Wilson will be joining BigTent on Substack Live at 2 o'clock to discuss hot topic issues and citizen power. And now I'm so excited to welcome these two incredible women to BigTent, both for the first time. Maya Kornberg, Ph.D., is a senior research fellow and manager at the New York Law Brennan Center for Justice. She is the author of the book, which we're talking about tonight, Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress, and Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in Lawmaking. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, NPR, BBC, the New York Times, Newsweek, The Hill, Slate, and other outlets. Congressman Lauren Underwood represents Illinois' 14th Congressional District and is the first woman, first person of color, and first millennial to serve her community in Congress. A registered nurse, she is the co-founder and co-chair of the Black Maternal Health Caucus, leading efforts to improve maternal health outcomes and eliminate disparities. She also serves as co-chair of the House Democratic Policy and Communications Committee on the House Appropriations Committee. Before Congress, Representative Underwood served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she implemented the Affordable Care Act and to strengthen the nation's public health preparedness. So welcome to BigTent, Dr. Kornberg and Representative Underwood. Let's get into it. So the first question tonight is, what does stuck mean in relationship to Congress? And I'm going to turn it over to you first, Dr. Kornberg.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for hosting the event, and thank you again to everyone for joining. The title of the book, I think, speaks to what a lot of us are feeling right now about American democracy, that it feels stuck, that in so many ways it is failing to deliver for Americans in the way that it was intended to do. And so my book is an attempt to look backwards in order to chart a course forward. It starts in 1974, and it tells a 50-year story of congressional reform efforts, and it documents how increasing political violence, relentless fundraising demands, and other barriers have made it so much harder for members of Congress to make change today than I would argue ever before. And it also spotlights how effective reformers like Congresswoman Underwood are still pushing forward what effective reform looks like and what solutions we need to unstick Congress. I want to also add a little note about Congress, because it's such an unpopular institution. And yet, I think it is the linchpin of American democracy. I think that if we want to unstick democracy and make democratic institutions better at a time when we see the Trump administration pushing the bounds of executive abuse, and at a time when we see so much thirst for engagement with government on the part of so many Americans, we need the people's branch. We need Congress, the first branch, to stand up. And so unsticking it, I think, is more urgent than ever.
Great. Representative Underwood, what does stuck in Congress mean to you? You are actually in Congress.
Well, I do think that we are in the middle of the least productive Congress, I believe, in U.S. history in terms of the number of bills passed and enacted into law. And I think that we are facing enormous challenges, that the American people are demanding action from their elected representatives, and they get frustrated when they see the dysfunction, the gridlock, and then simultaneous chaos from the executive branch, right? And they're like, can't you all just do something? That's what I hear so often, this phrase, fight harder, do something. And I think it really echoes the sentiment that Dr. Kornberg references with her title Stuck. It's just a really challenging point in our democracy and our system of checks and balances. Kind of relied on having leaders who wanted the legislative branch to work and be effective. If they want to neuter this key branch of our government, they can do so. But now we have to live with those consequences. And some of them, I think, really were unintended, or at least not as forecasted or as they imagined. And so often it's the least among us, the most vulnerable Americans, who are paying the price.
Indeed, that is very true. So, Dr. Kornberg, you mentioned that your book really tracks the three reform-minded congressional classes, 74, 1994, and 2018, which you were a member of, Representative Underwood. So I'd love to get a sense why you picked those three cohorts and just a quick overview of, what they each represent. And then I'd
Mhm.
love to get into the 2018 class, which Congresswoman Underwood was part of.
So I wanted to write a book about change making in Congress, right? What that looks like when folks get there. And I believe as a congressional scholar that Congress is perhaps the most changeable, the most malleable when there's a big wave class that comes in, when there is fresh energy and new members who can shake things up. And so I chose to focus the book on three of the largest classes that have come into the House of Representatives over the past 50 years and anchored the story in that. Of course, the book progresses chronologically, throughout the decades, but it is really anchored in these three classes. 1974, we have a class that is energized by running against the Watergate scandal, an increasingly unpopular and costly war in Vietnam, and they ran change campaigns not so dissimilar from some of the change campaigns we're seeing today. And they were swept into Congress, over 90 new members, on this promise of fixing things. And what they did, my book delves into this, is to really dramatically change the process in Congress of how things get done and to amplify in so many ways the power of rank and file members, in addition to pushing forward kind of key legislation that we saw in the 70s when it came to strengthening congressional power of the purse and war powers and so many other things that we saw in the 70s. The class of 1994 is the Republican Revolution. This is Republicans who came to Congress after 40 years of uninterrupted Democratic control of the House. They again wanted to shake things up. The book tells a slightly different story about this class in the sense that it was a really iron-handed leader, Newt Gingrich, who pushed forward so many of, again, those really critical structural changes that we saw, including, and I know we're going to get into this later, a real systematic dismantling of congressional support institutions and support agencies that are meant to help Congress. And then, of course, Congresswoman Underwood can tell the story of 2018 better than I do, and that's why the book spotlights her and so many other wonderful reformers in the class of 2018. This is a class that, again, came in and shook things up in Congress. I'll just mention two things that I think are interesting about the class. Firstly, over 100 candidates in that class signed a letter to Congress before they were elected saying, we want the first bill that Congress takes on to be a Democratic reform bill, to be what ended up being H.R. 1. So again, a class that is cohered around its desire for reform. And like the classes that I mentioned before, this is a class that was younger and had different lived experiences and kind of different professional backgrounds than some of the other classes before it. So I think, these classes tell an interesting story that allows us to kind of zoom out and look more broadly at congressional development over these past 50 years.
Great. So Representative Underwood, you run with this huge cohort. It was very exciting to see so many of you win. There were a lot of women who ran and won. A lot of women who had served or like you had a medical background. Is a very different makeup of that class, and you energized so many of us around the country. So I'd love to hear your experience campaigning, and then once you got there, what you found allowed you to do things or not do things.
Well, the class of 2018 is a story of ordinary Americans responding to a crisis, what we thought was an existential crisis in our country, and stepping forward to serve. Many of us were not recruited in the traditional sense. Many of us had never held elected office before, including myself. We ended up flipping seats. So it's not as if, a senior Democrat in our districts retired and we were, plucked to succeed them, right? Like we were taking on entrenched Republican opponents and running people power campaigns in order to win. And so, my story was one of a district that had been long overlooked. Democratic party leaders in my community didn't think that the 14th could ever flip. And certainly not me as a young Black woman. I was 30 when I launched my campaign. They had never seen somebody like me, run a race like this. And they thought it was a long shot. But we won. And I won every county in the district, which had, again, not happened before, and became the first woman, the first person of color, first millennial to represent my district. I became the youngest Black woman ever elected to the Congress. And, I've been fortunate enough to be reelected and chosen to stay. The folks in our community continue to come out and support. In terms of issues in that 2018 cycle, healthcare was the number one issue on the campaign trail, without a doubt. We saw the president lifting up his efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. They were holding celebrations in the Rose Garden, talking about taking away healthcare coverage from people with pre-existing conditions. That was very resonant. The summer 2018, a lot of folks were very animated by the images every day on the news of kids in cages on the border and the complete inhumanity of that kind of a cruel immigration policy. And I think that those two factors really fueled a lot of energy. The democratic ecosystem had been organized that cycle by Trump's election, really. So we had, large women's marches, and then the groups stayed active, the formation of indivisibles in these indivisible chapters all across the community, and then other activist groups were working with traditional Democratic Party infrastructure in order to propel our campaigns to victory.
So you have this really transformative campaign and do things that no one thought you could do. You weren't part of the party. And then you get to Congress, and what was that learning curve like? Like, talk us through your first 6 months to a year.
Well, the Congress is a crazy place. It was not built for, it was not built for women. You got to think about the origins of the institution, where the original congressmen were wealthy white male landowners. Okay, that's who the institution was built for. And so the rules, the traditions, the sequencing, the rhythm was really oriented with that kind of a mindset. And yes, there have been shifts, but at its core. So when you have, everything from security to how you get your committee assignments to, how the calendar is structured and what's the rhythm of travel, it was designed, by and for wealthy people who may not have been interested in full-time work, may not have wanted to be present and active, even in a, year-round legislature as compared to the way some of our states operate. And I think that my experience was one of having to navigate as a young woman with, a peer group and age that were, ideologically very different than me, meaning the squad. And, trying to navigate how to get things done in a very, very, very competitive district. I ended up having the tightest race in 2020. Ooh, and had to be in court for 6 months, right? So, my electoral situation was a little bit different than some others. And so I had to hustle to pass bills and show my effectiveness very, very quickly, whereas others had a longer runway.
I applaud you for um, for sticking with it. And you're now that you mentioned that about 2020, it's all coming back to me about the 6 month of litigation. So that might have to be another conversation at Big Tent because that is definitely in the playbook. So Dr. Kornberg, you made reference to this, especially with Newt Gingrich's control of Congress, his role of really changing some of the structures of Congress that has now had or unintended consequences for the Congress that we have to live with today. Can you talk us through that idea about shrinking capacity, shrinking support, and what that looks like as we think about how Congress functions or doesn't function today?
So what we see over the past few decades on Capitol Hill are two parallel stories that I tell in the book. On the one hand, and again, taking us back to 1995, when Newt Gingrich became Speaker after the 94 election, we had a speaker who defunded the Office of Technology and Assessment. That was a support agency that was meant to help Congress understand science. You know, you would think that that could still be helpful today. And cut funding, as I mentioned, to committees, which are a source of specialization and expertise in Congress and in legislatures in general, to other key support agencies that help Congress. And so it brought us to where we are today, where Congress has several thousand fewer staff members than it did a few decades ago. And yet it is dealing with increasingly complicated policy issues and huge constituencies that are far larger today, you know, almost 1 million people than they were when Congress was first formed, and it was 30,000 people in a district. And so that brings us to where we are today, where we have members and staff who are increasingly reliant sometimes on Googling complex policy questions, or I've had members and staff tell me about their use of AI to write bills and to solve problems where, of course, AI can help them, but we should not be relying on AI tools when we have experts that we can speak to. And we, in parallel, have had a lobbying industry that has quadrupled in size over the same period. And so what we have is a Congress that is increasingly vulnerable to manipulation by outside interests, and lack of staff or staff that just don't have the necessary professional expertise in a specific policy area is really the soft underbelly when it comes to Congress being vulnerable. My book tells a story, for example, of an antitrust expert, right? This is a very specific area of the law. And he was sent over from the Department of Justice to the Judiciary Committee. And he told me that when he arrived, lobbyists didn't know how to handle him because he actually knew the subject matter. And they were so used to dealing with staff who, the average staffer in Congress, and I'm a huge fan of the staff. Don't read me the wrong way. I think they're the backbone of Congress as an institution. But the average staffer is in their 20s. And they don't have that real, substantive expertise. And, because of pay issues and, pipelines and other things that we can get into, it's been really difficult for Congress to retain skilled staff. And I think that makes it harder for members to do their job. And it makes it harder for members to serve constituents and to deliver in the way that Congress was intended to do. To Congresswoman Underwood's point, we see a Congress that is at historic lows in terms of productivity. The staff capacity is a part of that. We see a Congress that is failing to stand up to the executive. Well, you can't conduct oversight if you don't have brain power to do it. So there's real life ramifications, I think, of what Congress did in the 90s and has really not undone until today.
Representative Underwood, how does that play out for you trying to do your job?
We are allowed to have 18 employees in congressional offices, and that's split between our district offices and in Washington, D.C. And so it gets to be really tight to be able to cover the core functions, meaning, legislative functions, it's particularly if you have multiple committees, which most members do. You need to have legislative aides with capacity to manage every single issue area that's actually important. You need to have comm staff. You need to have casework staff and outreach staff in the district. And it's just very difficult to be able to do all the work to service 750 to 800,000 constituents. And do legislative work with excellence, at least the way that I like to do my work with excellence. And so, some things are not done with excellence. You know what I mean? Some things you just don't quite get to with the level of rigor or timeliness or, you know, that you would ordinarily want because of these resource constraints. We are also operating on a very limited budget, typically under $2 million annually, and that's to cover all the technology, all of our travel, all of the staff salaries. And so, when I talk to incoming members, one of the first things I always tell them is that the finances of this job do not make sense. And so if you cannot try to make it make sense, you have to accept that it doesn't and move from there, right? This was an entity that was designed for that wealthy member to be supplementing someplace, sort of like ambassadors are selected for their wealth to be able to supplement and to rehab these embassies and to be able to pay for their special parties and all these other things, right? That it was designed for, the wealthy elites to be serving and supplementing in order to keep the legislative branch functioning.
We have a great question from Robin Hicks. And it's really relevant to what we're talking about. If Congress people are limited to 18 paid staff, is it possible to fill some basic administrative duties with volunteers that can support the paid staff and in turn the elected official? What do you think of that idea, Representative Underwood?
Well, we certainly do have interns. And in my office, we pay our interns. So there are no unpaid opportunities to engage in the official office, at least within Illinois 14. And the interns do vital work. I mean, we would not be productive without them. And so I don't want to ignore their great contributions. However, if we are talking about unsticking the legislative branch, right, it cannot be on the backs of someone making $15 an hour, part-time for a semester or less.
Dr. Kornberg, I hate to, I just feel like this is such an important point. So I just want to stick right here for just a minute. Has there been any attempt to sort of right this ship since, 1975?
Well, so it's interesting you mentioned 1975 because the number that Representative Underwood mentioned, 18 staff, that cap has not been changed since 1975.
Oh my God.
Despite the fact that, as I mentioned, constituencies are growing and we have complicated issues to deal with, and yet we haven't changed that cap since 1975. So it's certainly time that we do so. To the point that Congresswoman Underwood made, Congress has also not gotten a raise in 15 years. It's not a particularly popular argument, but I make it in my book and in other places that if we want not only the wealthy to afford to serve, then we need to give members a raise. And similarly, I think we need to be thinking about a pipeline and an equitable pay for staff. And so I do want to highlight some positives I think some wonderful changes that have been made in the last few years. One of the things that happened after the class of 2018 was elected that most people don't know about was that in 2019, Speaker Pelosi created the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. And that was a committee that for the first time in 3 decades introspected. And it said, how can we improve Congress as an institution? And so thanks to its efforts, and it passed over 200 recommendations, many of which have been implemented. And those included things like, for the first time, Congress having an IT department, Congress having a centralized HR hub, things that we would all assume are basic for an organization, pushing for things like staff pay. And I think that there are more paid interns in Congress today than there were 10 years ago, partially because of this conversation that the Modernization Committee and others have been having, creating more bipartisan spaces for staff to engage, for members to engage in a hyperpartisan Congress. And the list continues. But I do think that some of this internal process work that started in 2019 is happening behind the scenes. And it might seem mundane to folks, but I don't think it's mundane at all when we think about wanting to have the people's branch work effectively. And so I do think that we've been making some progress, and we should capitalize on that momentum and make some more changes.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts about that, Representative Underwood.
Well, the work of the Select Committee was transformative. I remember when I came to Congress, I had never seen more paper in my life. Like they did not use their email. That email was like a technicality that they assigned, but it was not actively employed. We would get, every day still, every bill that we vote on is printed out and bound and is waiting for us on the floor. You walk into a committee and it's just like reams of paper. I had to learn how to set up a filing system because I got so much paper. And then the pandemic happened, and then all of a sudden, people had to learn how to work via email and Zoom and all the rest, right? And so that was really a catalyst for a lot of reforms also, was that time when we had to learn how to work remotely and deliver, economy sustaining legislation for the American people during that time. But I will just say that, these kind of reform initiatives are very important. The legislative branch, is tasked with governing itself, which sometimes works, but oftentimes doesn't. We can look at the ethics process as an example and how members are really this week maybe can be lifted up as an example, but it's tough for members to be able to police themselves and to hold each other accountable. And I think that, there's a lot of assumption in the wisdom of the voter and who that voter chooses to send to Washington on their behalf. And that presumption ignores the role of money in politics. That presumption ignores incumbency bias. That presumption ignores, the fact that, there's, structural barriers to getting your name on the ballot and things like that. And so I just think as many opportunities as possible to have a conversation about how can we make this place work better for the American people is time well spent.
I could talk about this all night. I'm clearly a congressional nerd, but I would love to move on to social media and what impact that has on Congress. I read somewhere, maybe it was in your book, Dr. Kornberg, but that some congressional representatives have more comm staff than they do research or legislative staff. And okay, so you're shaking your head. That sounds right. So how does social media impact uh, how Congress performs, how individual members perform? And I'd love to have you weigh in that on that first, Dr. Kronberg, and then we'll turn it over to the Congresswoman.
So again, I want to start the story a few decades ago, as my book does. In the 1980s, television cameras were introduced for the first time into Congress. And I was reading, journalistic pieces from the time, and you had these journalists, writing in such a surprised tone that, oh, there's gotcha questions in hearing, and it seems like they're performing for the camera. Now that's just commonplace. We had Newt Gingrich in the 80s and 90s, and I apologize, there's a doorbell ringing. Okay, it's past now. Newt Gingrich in the 80s and 90s is known to have been giving speeches to an empty floor just because he knew that people were watching. So I think that the performativity element started before social media, and then we have social media exacerbating it. So there's a chapter in my book called Kings and Prophets, and it's an analogy that actually comes from Representative Sean Casten, who I interviewed for the book, where he differentiates between kings who govern and prophets with a megaphone. These are two kinds of political power. And right now, we see increasingly in a Congress where it's really difficult for members, and I think particularly for rank and file members and for freshman members to get things done, that there's a tendency to lean into that prophetic power, right? Because you can have a soundbite moment in a hearing, and that can elevate your public profile and raise public awareness without you ever having to touch a bill. And so that's one element of this. And I think another element that cannot be overstated in terms of its importance is money in politics. We have a system where fundraising is increasingly central to people's jobs. It's increasingly done online. It's increasingly nationalized. And so if you have a soundbite moment, you can use that to fundraise. So my book has the example of Republican Representative Joe Wilson screaming, "You lie," in the middle of Barack Obama's address to a joint session of Congress. And he used that clip to fundraise. That clip went viral. And so I think that there's a lot of incentives. And my book quotes Congresswoman Underwood, who I think is so insightful in and her thoughts on this, and saying that this is a quote from her, that there's an incentive structure for eyeballs and acclaim right now. And so we need to think really seriously about that when we also want members to be able to be driving policy. And we also want members to be able to, be the kings who govern. I think that we need to seriously examine the incentive structure. Of course, transparency is important. And of course, social media, and my book highlights also positive examples of the ways in which it connects members to their constituents, and the way in which members need to be transparent, and members of the public need to see what Congress is doing to also regain trust. But I think that there's a really slippery slope that we're reckoning with right now, and it's something that I think we need to take really seriously when we want to think about a government that is functioning in the way that it was intended to.
Representative Underwood, do you want to chime in on that and add what it's like being a member of Congress and seeing this play out in real time?
Well, digital time happens every day. Oftentimes, digital time is duplicated, right? You have your congressional digital time and you have your campaign digital time, and you might be talking about the same things. You might be talking about different things. But now we're in an environment where the average American is no longer ever, ever, ever engaging with a journalist, ever. And so, if we want our constituents and the country to understand the work that we're doing, we need to be communicating that directly, and it needs to be entertaining. Earlier in the conversation, I mentioned this phrase, fight harder, do something. And it took me a little over a year to realize when they say fight harder, they want to be able to watch you fighting in a 90-second clip and be entertained by it. And they want to click like. That's what it means. And so we have to just recognize that and give the people what they want. Because if we sit back and we're like, no, you're wrong, folks get these primaries and they lose. And they lose. Okay. And this is before we even talk about the money piece that Dr. Kornberg mentioned. And so, I think, at least on the Democratic side, that small dollar donor is a little bit more sophisticated these days. And after years of getting blown up via email and text messages asking for just $5, won't you chip in? Your viral moment doesn't always equate to the fundraising like it used to. But I would also argue that you might not need as robust fundraising if you have this cache of, viral clips and really compelling social media content where you're having a daily conversation with your community. So I just think that political communications at large has changed. And we are in an attention economy. And the average American spends 4 minutes, 4 minutes a week on politics. And 3 minutes and 30 seconds of that 4 minutes is on Donald Trump. And so we are competing with the final 30 seconds. And when you look through that lens, I think it helps explain a lot of the behavior that you see when you have these senators, raging on Dr. Fauci just to get a clip. That's all it's for, is just to get a clip. And so, I think we can call it a disgrace and we can judge and do all these other things, but I think that that's very much where we are in this moment.
How much time would you say you have to spend on that kind of communication with your constituents and with all of us?
Well, it's completely changed the way that I approach my 5 minutes in committee. If I have a, high profile witness before us in committee, we are very thoughtful about the line of questioning or how I use that time, whether or not I even ask a question, or do I use that time to communicate something that I want to share. Um, you know, Oversight doesn't have to happen in that 5 minute block, but we can have a meaningful interaction that the American people can really understand. And then we can follow up with our oversight letters and visits and engagements and the rest, right? Like, it just changes the way that we approach floor speeches. It changes the way that we approach site visits in the district. Like, in the district, you're probably going to see me with a camera, and we're gonna record and clip and share it broadly because there's so few people that we touch in person, and the potential to reach hundreds of thousands or millions online. And so we just approach the job through the lens of how can we multiply the reach.
Yeah. And I'm sure that wherever you go, people want to get a photo with you, want to get a selfie, want to
It's just the kids. You tell them they're going to be on YouTube
Okay.
and they're like, oh my God.
Well, if I met you, I'd want a selfie. Okay. So I'm just going to say that. Um, so we have a lot more to cover, and I wanted to move on to the issue of violence. And for those of us who get really frustrated with the comments that we hear from other elected officials who come on and say that their Republican colleagues don't support Trump, don't like, Kash Patel for FBI director, don't want to do all the things that they end up doing. It's very frustrating for us because they choose Donald Trump's pick or they choose his policy rather than what they believe in. And what we hear time and time again is that it is the threat of political violence that becomes the focal, the most important thing to them, because it comes after they come after their family, they come after loved ones, all of the things. And so I'm going to start with you, Representative Underwood, about how political violence impacts your day to day potentially, but overall, how your colleagues move through their lives and make their decisions.
Well, when I first started, I never had security ever at campaign events or at congressional events. But we have had a variety of different threats. I was at the Capitol on January 6th. And I decided that day that I would not die doing this job. And so we take security very seriously. I represent a community where, we elect sheriffs, and many of our elected sheriffs do not share values. And so there are some places that me and my staff don't go at night because we know that that local law enforcement person may not be as responsive as we would hope. And so, I'm grateful that in this Congress, the speaker has worked with Lear Jeffries, and we now receive 20,000 a month in security funding that is coordinated kind of separately from our regular congressional budgets. The Sergeant at Arms, which is one of the security offices for the Congress, has offered, great resources to me and my family to ensure our safety as I continue to serve Illinois' 14th district. And, I am grateful that I've not had any kind of like deadly interaction. I feel like we've come close, not targeted at me, but just in general. And the threat of violence is very, very, very dominant in how we navigate and move around the community every single day. I don't, if my attendance someplace is pre-announced on the internet, I will have security now. And so that limits where I go. And, because that turns into a whole other thing, right? And it's a shame that we just can't have casual, personal, like intimate interactions with constituents anymore. But these are the times we're in.
Hmm. Well, it's good to hear that there is some funding
Yes.
for security and that you're not paying for it out of pocket, because I would imagine that would be untenable.
That's how
Uh,
it was at the beginning. We had to pay for it out of pocket, or the campaign had to pay for it. And I remember when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar were getting these crazy threats, and they talked about the requirement to fundraise for their own safety and how people saw, the large small dollar contributions or these viral moments, and they thought, the money was being spent on one thing, and it was really just to make sure that they could go home at the end of the day safely.
Dr. Kornberg, give us an overview of how political violence has impacted Congress since that first cohort to now Lauren's cohort, that 50-year perspective.
So political violence is certainly not new in this country. As we all know, this country was forged in violence, and I think it continues to be baked into so much of American culture. But because of changes in gun ownership laws and patterns, because of social media, which has become a major vector for abuse, because we're seeing American political violence, which has always been racialized and gendered, interacting with Congress in a different way when we see a Congress that is more diverse than ever. We're seeing different effects of political violence in Congress, I think, now than we did a few decades ago. And we know from data which bears out what Representative Underwood was saying, that members are facing increasing threats. It's not just January 6th. The U.S. Capitol Police, which tracks incidents of threats and attacks against members, showed that between 2018 and 2023, we had a doubling of incidents of violence and threats against members, and that's continued to rise in the last 2 years that they've tracked since then. And so my book and my research point to three central ways that this is actually distorting lawmaking itself. The first one, which Representative Underwood mentioned before, is that it is constricting civic engagement. You know, I interviewed Representative Scanlon, and she said to me something that stuck with me, which is, how can we not have the 2011 shooting of Gabby Giffords, Representative Gabby Giffords, which happened at a Congress at Your Corner event? How could we not have that in the back of our minds when we have a Congress at Your Corner event? And so we are seeing members cancel town halls or engagement events or move them online, I think, which started with COVID and increases and allows them to engage, but I think in a different and perhaps less organic way. We're seeing this really impact civic engagement kind of across the board. We're seeing a Congress that really, I think, is increasingly inhospitable to members, both staying in office and it's shaping the candidate pipeline. My book has a quote from Nancy Pelosi's memoir where she says, "When I speak to young, dynamic people thinking of running for Congress, particularly women, they tell me that what happened to Paul Pelosi is one of their biggest deterrents in running." And so we have to take that seriously, especially when we know, and research that I've done with colleagues at the Brennan Center and that many others have done shows time and time again that violence has a disparate impact on women, on people of color, on young people, on other marginalized groups in the United States. We have to think about that when we see the wave of retirements and when we see how hard it is to get people to run for office. And lastly, I think in many instances, members are afraid to vote their conscience because they're afraid of violence. There's a quote in the book from Liz Cheney saying that she's had members say to her that they would have voted to impeach the president, but they were afraid for the safety of themselves and their families. And just think about how shocking that is in a democracy. For members to say, I'm not going to vote my conscience because I'm afraid for the safety of my family, that's just not a status quo that I think that we should accept. And that's why I've been really heartened to see Congress for the first time, just very recently, creating these security stipends for members. And why I'm heartened to see things that we've fought long and hard for at the Brennan Center, like FEC rules that allow candidates to use campaign funds for security. That's also actually relatively new. And I think we need to keep pushing because it's just not a tenable situation.
No, it is not. It is a very distressing part of American culture right now. And you're right, it's always been there, but it does seem to be, totally amplified and on fire right now. And it's distressing. So I want to quickly pivot to age is really the age of our representatives is a huge issue in this election, and it has been for the last few cycles. But obviously, Mitch McConnell's in the hospital. No one's talked to him. There was a representative in Texas who was in memory care who recently passed away. We've obviously had this on both sides of the aisle. And so I would love to have you both weigh in on that and how that's impacting not only the work of Congress, but how Americans view Congress, because that is a huge problem. There's no faith in the institution, as we said at the top of the call. So, Dr. Kornberg, can you talk about that? I know it's not a central theme, but it is a real issue.
So I have been advocating for an upper age limit for members of Congress, and I've made the case for this publicly. We have in this cycle over 24 members of Congress over 80 that are running for re-election. And we have a Congress where the average age in the Senate is in the 60s and the average age in the House is in the 50s. And so I've argued for an upper age limit, which I think is actually very conservative, of 80 years old. I know Rahm Emanuel and others have argued for 75. I think that we need a Congress that is more descriptively representative of the American people. And to the point that Representative Underwood made earlier, when there's such incumbency advantage, when we have like 95% of incumbents winning their re-elections, an upper age limit would also, I think, create some more open seats and opportunities for new politicians to penetrate the system. But that's, I think, only one step. The thing that I want to highlight when it comes to why Congress is so old is campaign finance. My book starts in 1974. 1976, the Buckley v. Valeo decision of the Supreme Court allowed unlimited spending by campaigns. There was no spending cap. And then Citizens United in 2010 allowed unlimited outside spending. And so as a result of that, it's becoming so exorbitantly expensive to run for office. And we just saw a whole set of expensive primaries this week. That it is really difficult for younger Americans, for working Americans, for so many other groups with less access to wealth in this country to run for office. And so I think if we want a Congress that is representative of the American people, we certainly need upper age limits like we have for judges and for other positions, and we need campaign finance reform. And I think that both of those things are really crucial when it comes to a Congress that looks like and is able to represent the people that it represents.
Representative Underwood, how does the age issue play out for you in doing your job and in working with your colleagues?
Well, I'm definitely in an intergenerational workplace, and so there's, a lot of joy that comes along with that. And then, some things that we're just all aware of as we navigate. I just think that the American people should recognize that the generational change is happening. It is happening. And we see it, at least on the Democratic side, from the leadership team on down. And while we do have some, very senior, experienced voices in our caucus, they are outnumbered by younger members who bring our youth and experiences and perspectives and energy as well. And so, I think of the many crises facing our democracy. I think that what folks call the gerontocracy, that is being worked out. There's some other things that are not. And so I think that, within the next 5 years, we will not be having a conversation about the gerontocracy.
Okay, so you just said some other things are not being worked out. Can you talk about that a little bit more for us?
Well, yeah, I mean, this productivity issue, I think the issue around safety, I think, you have to create a disincentive. That's not happening. What they're doing is that they're giving a security officer, someone with a gun can walk around with me, but we're not giving a disincentive to this crazy person who wants to kill me and my family, right? And like until we get to that part, this fundamentally is not going to change. Until we have Donald Trump stop saying stand back and stand by, saying find people on both sides, lifting up white supremacists and these hate mongers, you know what I mean? We're not going to really see that fundamentally change. That's what I'm thinking about when I make a statement
Okay.
like that.
Yeah.
The idea of and then there's just like the structural part that's been mentioned in the comments, right? Like, is 435 actually the right number?
Mhm.
Probably not. Is a 2-year term really constructive in this day and age? Probably not. You know what I mean? There's just some things that if we were really serious about examining the legislative branch and really working hard to optimize that to meet the needs of the American people, we would make some fundamental changes to the way that the House and the Senate are comprised, and certainly the way that they do their work.
We're getting close to time, but I have to ask. I'm gonna take a question that was in the chat. It was really good, but I want to change it because it really speaks to the current stuckness of the Congress under Mike Johnson's leadership. So, Representative Underwood, I'd love to have you talk about what it is like to serve under Mike Johnson versus Nancy Pelosi, because Johnson seems to be a very uniquely weak and feckless leader. And I'd love to have you weigh in on that.
Okay, so I just want to say I'm a partisan. I'm a Democrat. I did not vote for Mike Johnson. I voted for Hakeem Jeffries some like 25 times. Okay, so let's just start there so that everybody's very clear. Mike Johnson is terrible. He is a disgrace to the office that he holds. He needs to be removed. And I keep waiting for my Republican colleagues to call the vote. I mean, how many times can this man show you that he doesn't have what it takes to hold the third powerful most office in our country? I mean, he is terrible. But the good thing is, Mike Johnson's going to be spending some more time with his family in about 6 months. And I think we all can celebrate that.
Okay. So, Dr. Kornberg, what have you seen that's really highlighted Mike Johnson's failure as leader?
So I'll preface my comment by saying that I'm here
Not
with
a
a
partisan.
501(c)(3) hat on.
Yep.
I want to take a step back from like one particular leader, and I think just shed light on something that people don't realize about Congress in general. Uh, we all learned the kind of schoolhouse rock version of how a bill becomes a law, right? It's introduced and then it's sent to committee and then it's deliberated on and then it's sent back for a vote. And that is just not the way that things work in Congress right now. As a result of some of the changes that I mentioned and that I delve into more in the book, we have a system where frequently it is party leadership on both sides writing a bill, sometimes with the help of lobbyists, pushing it down very quickly for a vote. And some members have told me that they don't even have time to read a bill sometimes before they have to vote on it, let alone deliberate. And that's not the case always. But I do think that when we talk about how unproductive Congress is, and when we talk about what it would mean to have, I think, better leadership, we need to start by thinking about leadership that wants rank and file members to have more of a say. I think we need to think about leadership that wants to empower committees again, in a way that they have not been empowered in Congress in many decades. A leadership that really wants people who were elected to be able to do their job. And that is not what is happening right now. And so what I would like to see in the 120th Congress is a rules package. A rules package guides kind of how the House work, a rules package that is designed to help Congress work better. I would like to see leadership that is committed to making sure that Congress can pass legislation and conduct oversight, which are its two jobs, neither of which it is doing effectively right now. So I think more structurally, that's what I would like to see us get to in the next 6 months.
Congresswoman Underwood, what would you like to see happen? Should Mike Johnson be spending a lot more time with his family in 6 months? What would you recommend happening?
Well, I agree with what Dr. Kornberg said about the rules package. That's a very, very, very important first vote that happens at the beginning of every Congress. More broadly, I just want us to work with the urgency that we have seen on display. As Democrats, we like to be right. We like to argue with each other and debate so that we can get to like the best version of policy, and then and only then do we bring that forward. And I think that that's a luxury in this moment. There's so much that's broken, and we need to work quickly to fix it. And that means that things will be imperfect. Sometimes that means that we will make mistakes. But we don't have a moment to waste. And I hope that we really reflect on what we've seen on display in this first year and a half of the Trump term and really, learn from the speed in which they have executed their agenda.
Yes, it's been breathtaking. So last couple minutes, I'd love to have you, I'm going to give you guys a magic wand and you can tell us one or two things. If you could wave your magic wand and make it happen today to fix the whole infrastructure of our republic, how our three branches function together. What's the magic wand? How would you use your magic wand? So Dr. Kornberg, why don't you start us off? One or two things you'd wave the wand for.
So I'd say two things. Firstly, and my book speaks to this, a lot of my research speaks to this, money in politics is, I think, one of the biggest distortions to allowing us to get to a functional government. We're seeing a system right now in which it is so hard to be elected and in which the fundraising demands just keep rolling in after you're elected. And I think, also shape the pathways to leadership in the House and so many other things and the way the members are spending their time. And so overturning Citizens United and really, digging down into campaign finance reform could not be important. And I think that goes hand in hand with ethics reforms like banning stock trading in Congress, and strengthening ethics enforcement in Congress, and ethics kind of more broadly across government right now when we see so much corruption. I think part and parcel with that, I want to see Congress that is taking itself seriously, that is making the changes internally so that it can deliver for the American people. And so that starts with, some of the changes we could see in a new rules package, like strengthening ethics enforcement and making sure that committee procedure is organized in the right way, and organizing committees for the first time since the 70s in a way that makes sense. There's a lot of internal things that might seem like navel gazing to the American public, but I think are so important. And also it's important for Congress to resource itself for success. When we have a Congress that had several thousand fewer staff than it did several decades ago, how is that Congress going to be fighting back against Trump like the American people want it to? And so I want to see candidates and electeds and all of us thinking about not just the election and what happens in November, but what happens the day after and what happens in January, so that we can make sure that this institution that we're, so many of us are canvassing and caring about the elections in different ways. How can we make sure that the people that we elect actually have the power to push forward the agenda that the American people sent them to Congress to push forward? So again, campaign finance reform and then institutional reform within Congress, I think, are just more urgent than ever.
I hope Representative Underwood, will you give Hakeem Jeffries a copy of Stuck? We will send you a free copy for that effort.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay, wave your
So,
wand,
yes,
Representative Underwood.
my wish is pretty simple. We have a vibrant multiracial democracy. Our country is changing before our eyes, and it is getting richer and more interestingly textured, and we are younger and more diverse than we've really ever been, certainly bigger than we've ever been. And that is not reflected in the United States House of Representatives, and for sure not the United States Senate. And we've got to change that. And we also need to stop allowing the US Supreme Court for undermining the core rights of this vibrant multiracial democracy. And so, we have a lot of work to do, not just to make government work better, but to really do some restoration and reimagining, so that we have a government that's truly of, by, and for the people, as we are now. And I just really want us to keep that in mind. Um, we've had a series of presidents who like to look backwards, right? Make America great again, or restore the soul of America, right? That's a backwards looking vision. And I think that if we are really going to find success, we have to embrace this country that we are now and who we are becoming. And I think that we're up for the challenge.
Well, you got a lot of love in the chat for this incredible conversation. We're so appreciative to you to both of you for joining Big Tent tonight, for your work, your commitment to our country, and to all of us. We're just so grateful to both of you. Keep it up, keep fighting. We hope you'll both come back to Big Tent. And I hope everyone has a great night tonight. And tomorrow you wake up and you start to take action every single day until the election. 90 days. Here we go. Buckle up. Let's get it done. And everyone have a great night. Thanks for coming to Big Tent. Bye, everybody.